medical leadership, if anything?
Well, if I look at that through the lens of the organisation that I know best, and I've said this to them, this is the time that all of their career has been leading to. Their expertise as clinicians and what they've learnt about leadership has been put to the test and contributed more on this occasion than ever before, because you've got an unprecedented threat to patients with, at least initially, not the knowledge of how to deal with it. And you needed to adapt clinical services at a speed that nobody would ever have even contemplated doing before. So the medical leadership that I know most about, the ones in Wrightington, Wigan and Lee, they rose to that task, or most of them did, formidably. And to me, you know, the world will never be the same again in a hospital. And the demonstration of what medical leaders can do will never be, they'll never have a greater chance than they had on those occasions. So I think it was the making of a lot of them. But equally, I do know that a lot have been burnt out, exhausted, damaged, you know, can't stand the thought of it anymore.
Yeah, and of course, we're not through it. We're still very much in it, aren't we? And particularly, again, if you're thinking of those orthopedic surgeons you mentioned earlier, there's a huge backlog to catch on. I suppose if you were, now that we've got, you know, a year of the pandemic gone and, you know, hopefully with the success of vaccinations, although clearly not in every country, things may start to settle down. If you were to advise FMLM now rather than last January when you were talking to Peter, what would you be saying that he and his organisation must concentrate on going forward?
Well, as you possibly appreciated from this interview, I think that what works really well in talking about quite complex concepts like medical leadership and so on are stories.
Yeah.
And I think that if MLM were to collect stories, COVID stories of medical leadership, and, you know, I've given you a couple of them, but they could get many more from many more organizations. I think that they could use that in a way that is going to be far more convincing to people who want to learn about medical leadership, and far more dramatic. I mean, dramatic stories are always better at making a point than routine ones. So that, I think if anything, as a result of COVID, I would persuade them that. There is another aspect, is that there are all sorts of things that we have done during COVID, which previously everybody said, oh, you can't do them. You know, remote consultations. Oh, no. What? Orthopedic consultants working on a ward. No. ENT surgeons helping out in critical care. No. So a whole load of myths have been debunked. And the risk now, and it's beginning to happen already, is that people just revert back to the old way of doing things. And I think the not just medical, but the general management challenge at the moment is to look at all those things that happen and say, well, if they really were good, why don't we stick with them? You know, why do we have outpatient departments at all anymore? I mean, you know, Nigel Edwards used to famously say that an outpatients department is a warehouse in which we store people until we're ready to use them, which is probably one way of looking at it. But I think, you know, what's been demonstrated is that for 80% of consultations, they can be virtual.
Yeah. I've heard similar things about how, because of the necessity to move at pace, governance didn't get forgotten, but it certainly got, you know, downplayed a bit. And now governance is coming back because people are getting much more defensive and fearful of what might have been missed, and, you know, record waiting times and all the rest of it. So,
there were one of the pieces of work that I did when I was in NHSE last year, which Alistair Henderson was involved in actually, was created a document which had a long title, something like a framework for clinical blah, blah, but we called it permissions. And what this was that in order to cope with coronavirus, people had to change the way of doing things in a way that previously they would have been worried about the regulatory comeback, about the legal comeback, about their professional body, about their trade unions. So we got all of those bodies to effectively give permission. I mean, the most dramatic example was probably in critical care, where previously in intensive care, you had to have one nurse to one patient. And of course, we produced a document that said you could have 2 to 1, 3 to 1, 4 to 1, even 8 to 1, provided you have a variety of other things to do. And it gave the endorsement to that from the NMC, the GMC, the Society of Critical Care Medicine, and so on and so on. So that was why it was called permissions. But quite a lot of the permissions document was based on the extraordinary power that the Secretary of State had to basically protect anybody from doing anything because of coronavirus. And that power still remains, but it will be removed at some point, I would guess sometime within the next 3 months. And that's the point where people will have to find a different way of justifying doing things differently than just, I can't be prosecuted for it.
Yeah, it seems to me they've got to work out how to balance the risk, I suppose, of going backwards, but the risk of not going forwards.
Well, exactly. And you know, the NHS is quite good at doing analyses like that. You know, you'll have a balance sheet of advantages and disadvantages, but I think that in previous years, there was never the experience of having done it. It was just, we couldn't do that because it wouldn't work. Well, we have actually done it for 12 months and it did work.
Yeah. Andrew, is there anything that I've not asked you that you think's relevant around medical leadership development, whether that's the leadership development for doctors or whether that's the kind of development of medical leaders? Because I think that there is a slight nuance between them. You know, what should they be learning versus how much we should be promoting them as a kind of slightly distinct type of doctor?
I think the only other thing that I thought of before speaking to you was about the relationship between medical leaders and politicians. And politicians it doesn't matter which party is in power at the time, they are not loved by medical leaders. They are treated with remarkable scepticism, reasonably enough, I would say. And yet, when you go into a medical leadership position, you are part of a hierarchy that works its way up through to ultimately to the politicians. And I think that there is an element of medical leadership which is handling that well. And I think it consists sometimes in translating the message. So, for example, we now will probably get some sort of a directive to organisations that says that they want to reduce the waiting list progressively over the next 12 months and have a series of targets. And if a medical leader goes along to a bunch of clinicians and say, right, we need to reduce the waiting list because here's the set of government targets, I think it's quite unlikely that they'll get hugely warm and enthusiastic buy-in. If the medical leader reinterprets that into one of clinical risk to patients who have not had treatment for a period of time, and therefore, for example, the Royal College of Surgeons has produced these 6 levels of clinical urgency and uses that to drive a reduction of waiting lists, then they're going to get much more traction. And that's just one example of almost everything to do with how the NHS is run, where doctors will be very resistant to anything that they see as being politically motivated or even politically demanded. So you have to sort of rewrite things in terms of what's in the interest of patients. And despite all of the cynicism that we have about politicians, quite often they are actually trying to do what's in the interest of patients.
Yeah, I guess the danger is the profession then looks at those administrative elites in their profession as sort of, conduits for the government. They just
hold out. Yes, they do. They often do regard them as people of selling out. And you see medical leaders over the years who are very good at treading. I mean, right now you look at the way the chief medical officer has managed himself over the last 12 months as an independent expert and not a sort of plaything of Boris Johnson. And somebody, I don't know if you know Keith Willett, who's been the sort of the national czar for the emergency. Again, lots and lots of examples where the way they talk and the way they describe things makes people realize that they are their own people. They work in a political environment, but they're doing things for the right reason.
Yeah, and actually how complex it is. I've heard lots of different views on Chris Whitty and Stephen Powis about being stooges and then actually being braver. And it's that thing about if you no longer have your job, you no longer got the ability to influence.
Absolutely, yeah. You've got a little leeway to disagree with the top people,